we're all too already painfully aware of what's happening. The global economy is overshooting 6 planetary boundaries now, and we can see devastating Earth system changes playing out around us in real time. What's happening now in Libya and Greece and several other places with devastating flooding is enough to remind us. Ignorance is no longer an option. So let me start instead with a different observation, one that's equally important. People have a tendency to refer to this crisis using the language of the Anthropocene, right? The term is useful, of course, to highlight the fact that for the first time in geological history, human activity is dramatically reshaping our planet and our climate. But the term is also incorrect. It's not humans as such that are causing this crisis. Rather, it's being driven by our system of production, namely capitalism, and is caused almost entirely by a small number of rich countries in the global north, primarily to the benefit of their elites and corporations. Now, right off the bat, I want to be very clear what I mean by capitalism here. When people think about capitalism, they often think of things like markets and trade and businesses, right? But these things existed for thousands of years before capitalism, and they're innocent enough on their own. What distinguishes capitalism, for our purposes here, is that it's organized around and dependent on constant expansion, perpetually increasing levels of industrial production, which we measure in terms of market prices, or GDP. If the economy doesn't grow, and this is strange, right? If the economy doesn't grow, it crashes into crisis, which we experience every few years with devastating consequences for ordinary and working class people. It's a deeply unstable system. And crucially, under capitalism, the purpose of increasing production like this is not in fact primarily to improve human well-being or to achieve social progress or any specific ecological goals. Rather, it's to extract and accumulate an ever-increasing quantity of profit. That's the overriding objective. And this process, crucially, has no identifiable endpoints. Indeed, the dominant assumption in economics is that this should carry on indefinitely, that every industry, every sector, every national economy should continue to increase production year after year, regardless of whether or not we actually need it. Such a system, I'm sure you'll agree, is irrational at the best of times, and in the middle of an ecological emergency, is clearly madness. The problem is that, of course, production doesn't come out of thin air. It entails the use of energy and materials. Now, it's important to grasp that the world economy is characterized by extraordinary inequalities in energy and material use. Let's have a look at energy first. High-income countries, on the right of this graph, use vastly more energy than the rest of the world, far more than what we know empirically is compatible with feasibly decarbonizing fast enough to meet the Paris Agreement goals, which is also more than what we know is or would be required to meet everyone's needs at a good standard if that was our objective. Now, this brings us to a paradox, which I want to highlight. Why is it that rich economies have such high levels of production and energy use, while at the same time large numbers of their own citizens basically cannot make ends meet? In the USA, for example, 40% of people cannot afford healthcare. And by the way, we just learned that child poverty is increasing in the USA over the past year. In the UK, 4.3 million children live in poverty. In the EU, 90 million people struggle to access basic goods and services. The reason is because capitalism is highly undemocratic. Decisions about what to produce and how to use resources and who benefits from the surplus that we all collectively generate, all of this is controlled by the 1% who own the majority of corporate shares and who elect the directors of firms. And what they choose to do is to produce things that maximize their profits, things like fossil fuels and advertising and SUVs, rather than things like public health care, public transit, affordable housing, renewable energy, etc. The result is that we have a system that simultaneously overuses resources and at the same time fails to meet many people's basic needs. So we face a double crisis, in fact, an ecological crisis that is also a social crisis at the same time, driven by the same underlying causes. Now, the consequence of excess energy use in the core economies is that these countries are also overwhelmingly responsible for the vast majority of excess emissions that are causing climate breakdown. This graph shows cumulative global carbon emissions since 1850. You can see how the safe planetary boundary, which is the green line in this graph, was violated in the late 1980s, tipping us into what we might describe today as climate breakdown. With business as usual, as you can see, both the 1.5 and 2 degree limits will be breached within the next 2 decades. which is devastating. Now, let's break this down a little bit. Here's the global south. As you can see, the south as a group is still within its fair share of the safe planetary boundary, and has therefore not contributed to climate breakdown at all. Of course, some countries within the global south have in fact violated their national fair shares, as we're going to see shortly. But here's the global north, by which I mean the wealthy core economies of Europe, the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, and Japan, right? The north exceeded the planetary boundary in the early 1900s and has now already violated its fair share of the 1.5 and 2-degree carbon budgets twice over, counting from 1850. Okay. By the way, here we can see Norway and China, with Norway on the left here, compared to China on the right. And I think this is actually important for us to understand, given the predominance of misinformation that's out there in our media. China has only just recently exceeded its fair share of the planetary boundary. That's a problem, and China must decarbonize very quickly. But note that Norway has burned its fair share several times over, right? So obviously a much bigger contributor to the crisis in this respect. Now the result is that the countries of the global north, which are represented in red in this graph, are responsible for 87% of all emissions globally in excess of the planetary boundary. In other words, 87% of all the damages caused by climate breakdown everywhere it happens in the world, right? Now, I understand, I argue that we need to understand this reality as a process of atmospheric colonization. The atmosphere is a shared commons on which all of us depend for our existence. And the rich countries of the earth have appropriated it for their own enrichments with devastating consequences for all of life on earth, right? The global south countries are responsible for 13% in total. Now, meanwhile, the global south, which has done very little to cause this problem, as you can see, suffers up to 92% of the economic costs and damages inflicted by climate breakdown, and up to 99% of all climate-related deaths. In other words, virtually all climate-related mortality is sustained in the territories of the global south. The injustice of this is staggering, and none of us should accept it. But climate is not the only crisis that we face. We also need to pay attention to material use, which is the main driver of biodiversity loss and ecosystem damage. This graph shows us global material use over the past half-century, including biomass, metals, minerals, and construction materials. The red line is what industrial ecologists indicate is the maximum sustainable boundary, at least the one that's most commonly used, 50 billion tons per year. And as you can see, we shot past that limit in the late 1990s. And as of today, the global economy is consuming or using 100 billion tons per year, which is overshooting the boundary by a factor of 2. And this is, again, a major driver of ecological pressure. But here again, it's the rich countries that are overwhelmingly responsible for this problem. This graph shows us the same data. This is per capita material use by country income group. Again, the red line is a sustainable level. We see that rich countries, over on the far right again, use on average 28 tons of materials per capita, which is 4 times over the boundary. And also, again, far more than we know is required to ensure good lives for everybody if that was the objective, like if our production system was organized in that way. Okay. By the way, let's have a look at Norway, which has one of the highest rates of material use in the world. Now, crucially, not all residents of rich countries are responsible for this. Richer individuals consume much more than working-class people, and we have to be very clear about that, right? But also, these high levels of resource use are also the effects of materially intensive provisioning systems, like transport systems that rely on private cars, for which individuals themselves are obviously not responsible, right? If you don't have the option of using a public transit system, you have no choice but to rely on a materially intensive transport alternative, okay? Meanwhile, note that lower-income countries obviously consume a small fraction of this, and they remain under sustainable levels. In most cases, crucially, they actually need to increase their use of materials and energy in order to build the infrastructure required for human development. Now, here too, excess resource use represents processes of colonization. Let me explain briefly how this works, because I think this is important to understand and gets too often left out of our discussion. So here's the key facts. Growth in the global north relies on a massive net appropriation of resources from the global south. In other words, the world economy is characterized by a net flow from south to north, from the periphery to the core of the world system. In a recent paper, we measured this using environmentally extended input-output models to define the full extent of appropriation in empirical terms. And the results are quite striking. We found that a net total of 12 billion tons of embodied raw materials is appropriated from the Global South every year. And by embodied here, I mean materials that are embodied, involved in the production of traded goods, right? Now that's double the total mass of resources that is normally extracted from the entire continent of Africa every year, consumed entirely in the global north, net of trade. 21 exajoules of embodied energy. That amount of energy would be enough to develop the infrastructure required to provide healthcare, education, housing, heating, cooling, refrigerators, electricity, public transit, computers, and other key necessities to the entire population of the Global South, ensuring good lives for everyone. But instead, it is used to fuel corporate growth in the Global North. 820 million hectares of embodied land. That's twice the size of India. And this amount of land could be used to provide nutritious food for 4 to 6 billion people. But instead, it's used to produce things like sugar for Coca-Cola, and beef for McDonald's, and cotton for H&M, consumed in the Global North. And then 188 million person-years of embodied labor. That's similar to Latin America's entire workforce. That labor could be used to staff hospitals and schools, to produce food and goods for local needs, to build houses. But instead, they work full-time, year after year, churning out tech gadgets and fast fashion for northern companies. This is not a small thing. This data shows that growth in the Global North depends utterly on this appropriation. It depends on sucking the life out of the ecosystems and human communities of the Global South. Now, what this means is that the social and ecological impacts of continued perpetual northern growth are offshored or externalized to the Global South. That's where the damage happens. You don't see it in Norway or in England. You see it in places like Brazil, Indonesia, and the Congo. This is the cause not only of environmental breakdown or degradation, but also of mass poverty and deprivation in the Global South. The value appropriated from the South each year is worth trillions of dollars and would be enough to end extreme poverty dozens of times over. But instead, the South is maintained in conditions of misery in order to shore up the possibility of continued capitalist growth in the core. In other words, the dual crisis of ecological breakdown and mass poverty is an effect of these dynamics in the world economy. Now, what I want to get across here is that imperialist appropriation along these lines is not incidental. It's not a side gig or an accident. As the Indian economist Utsa Patnaik puts it, imperialism is a structurally necessary feature of capitalist growth. In order to sustain perpetual expansion and accumulation, capital requires an ever-rising quantity of inputs, right? Resources and labor, the key inputs to production, at the lowest possible price. To achieve this, capital has to find ways of cheapening labor and resources, right? Now, one option is to exploit your national working class and your domestic ecology. But of course, this harms people, and sooner or later, you're likely to face a revolution. If you want to avoid this, and indeed, if you are under pressure to improve the conditions of your national working class, your only other option is to cheapen some third party who is not in a position to fight back. You need some kind of outside where you can exploit resources and labor with impunity and externalize social and ecological damages. This is where the colonies come in. For 500 years, capitalism has relied on forms of colonization and the exploitation of the people in the Global South to ensure a steady flow of cheap inputs. Now, this arrangement came under threat in the middle of the 20th century with the rise of the anti-colonial movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Newly independent governments refused to be plundered by northern capital. They pursued strategies of economic sovereignty, and they sought to reclaim their productive capacities to focus on local human needs. They used tariffs and capital controls to protect their markets. They used subsidies and planning to develop necessary industries that foreign capital was not investing in, and they used land reform to reclaim territory that had been appropriated by colonial firms. This approach succeeded marvelously at raising incomes and improving welfare across the newly independent Global South. It launched a development miracle. But northern powers were not pleased. as these progressive policies were cutting off their access to cheap labor and resources, which they'd enjoyed for the past 450 years. It undermined the colonial arrangements on which capitalism had depended, and this triggered a massive crisis for capital in the 1970s, especially given that at the same time wages were also rising in the core, thanks to the power of organized labor and the welfare state, okay, which gives workers significantly more bargaining power. So the governments of the core faced a fork in the road. They could either accept economic sovereignty in the global south and decent wages at home and abandon capital accumulation, thus shifting to a post-capitalist economy focused on well-being. Or they could try to maintain capital accumulation by somehow restoring the basic structure of the imperial arrangement. And they opted hard for the latter. First, they intervened militarily to depose anti-colonial leaders. The list here is long and includes several figures that all of us should know. Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, Sukarno in Indonesia, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Salvador Allende in Chile exactly 50 years ago, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, and many others, all deposed in Western-backed coups and replaced with right-wing dictatorships or military juntas backed by Western governments that were more amenable to Western economic interests and which rolled back the reforms of the progressive era. But northern states also intervened by using the World Bank and the IMF to impose neoliberal structural adjustment programs across the global south in the 1980s and 1990s. Structural adjustments forced governments to privatize national resources, to cut support for national industries, to cut protections on labor and on the environment, and to cut public services. This destroyed the South's economic sovereignty and pushed the prices of labor and resources back down, thus restoring the basic tenet of the imperial arrangement and rescuing capital accumulation in the global north. It restored the rate of corporate profit, it restored the flagging rate of growth in the north, and it allowed European governments to ensure a reasonable standard of living for their working classes, while still maintaining capital accumulation, which is the basic arrangement of social democracy, such as in the Scandinavian countries. And this arrangement, by definition, cannot be universalized. Now, this is not to say that you cannot have a welfare state without imperialism. You can. But you cannot have a welfare state and capital accumulation without imperialism, right? You have to choose. So for the South, this was devastating. Structural adjustment put them back into the position of being dependent on exports to and imports from the global north. But because structural adjustment also depressed prices in the global south, this means that for every unit of embodied labor and material they import, they have to export many more units to pay for it, okay? So this is what the Egyptian economist Samir Amin referred to as unequal exchange. And this is what generates the large net flows of resources from south to north that I described earlier. This is the form that imperialism takes in the 21st century. It is an arrangement that enables appropriation without the need, in most cases, for military occupation. And I hope that you can see how critically important this dynamic is to the entire question of ecology, because what is at stake here is ecology. Whose resources are available, and to who? So what do we do? With all of these problems in mind, what needs to happen? Let's start with materials. We know that rich countries need to reduce material use by more than half from existing levels. Of course, it depends on the country. There's widespread agreement on this, actually. Indeed, the objective of reducing material use to sustainable levels has been ratified by the European Parliament. Now, some of this can be achieved through efficiency improvements, yes, and we should pursue this vigorously. We should embrace and accelerate technological change, right? I am not anti-technology. I want to make that abundantly clear. I'm an accelerationist when it comes to this. Maybe we can talk about that later. But we also know that efficiency improvements alone are not enough. In a growth-focused capitalist economy, savings from efficiency improvements tend to be reinvested to expand the process of production and consumption, right? That basically makes absolute reductions very difficult to achieve. So you can make some headway, but really substantial headway is quite tough. Now, what about climate? Now remember, to stay under the 1.5 degrees carbon budget, to stay within that, we need to cut emissions to 0 by 2050. For high-income nations, which have very high per capita emissions, this requires very rapid emissions reductions, much faster, by the way, than lower-income nations. And this is a critically important point to understand. Now, because the area under these graphs has to be the same for a fair share, a fair distribution of the carbon budget. Now, we know that it's possible to absolutely decouple GDP from emissions, okay? Simply by transitioning to lower carbon energy sources. Indeed, several high-income countries have already achieved this, even when measuring emissions in consumption-based terms. This is not news. We've known about this since the 1990s, and it should not be surprising to anyone. As we're going to see, what matters here is the question of speed. But still, nonetheless, this fact of absolute decoupling, which again to scientists is not surprising, is routinely recruited to argue that not only is green growth possible, it is already here. And this is from the Financial Times. But what this discourse obscures is the fact that none of these countries that have done this, that have achieved this, are reducing emissions in line with what is required to stay under 1.5 degrees, or even well under 2 degrees, as the Paris Agreement demands. Existing trajectories are highly inadequate. Now, in a recent study published in The Lancet, we found that at current rates, the high-income countries that have achieved absolute decoupling will take, on average, 220 years to reduce emissions by 95%, blowing their carbon budget fair shares 27 times over in the process. There's nothing green about this. This is a recipe for disaster. It's extremely dangerous. Much faster emissions reductions are required. By the way, let's just talk very briefly about Norway. So this is Norway's consumption-based emissions are here in the dotted red line. They've increased over the past decade, which is bad news. That means that at existing rates, obviously, Norway would continue increasing its consumption-based emissions. That's unlikely to occur, but that gives you a sense for what's happening currently. And compare that with the green dotted line, which is what would be required if Norway was to stay within its fair share of the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. The budget for 1.7 degrees is obviously a little bit easier, but still obviously out of reach in this respect. In terms of territorial emissions, at current rates, Norway will take over 400 years to reduce emissions by 95%, okay, and that's territorial. So the question becomes, is it possible for high-income countries to achieve sufficiently rapid decarbonization? And the answer to this is yes, and that's the good news. But in a growth-oriented economy, it's extremely difficult to achieve and probably unfeasible, okay? The high-income countries that have achieved decoupling would need to accelerate their existing rates by a factor of 10 by 2025. And remember that every year of delay makes this calculus even more aggressive. Now, the reason this is so difficult is because in a growth-oriented scenario, our options are limited to roughly two things. One, renewable energy rollout, okay? So expanding solar and wind and batteries to catch up to energy use and to growth. And two, technological change, like shifting the entire vehicle fleet to EVs. This requires mobilizing labor and factories and infrastructure and materials and finance, of course. And it cannot just be accelerated just willy-nilly, especially given that our capacities in a growth-oriented scenario are already maxed out by other forms of production, right? Our factories and labor are already producing other things. So this is like an extra burden on top, as it were. But as the latest IPCC report notes, rapid decarbonization is much easier to achieve in a post-growth scenario. Now, let me emphasize again that post-growth research is pro-technology. It embraces efficiency improvements and embraces technological change. But again, recognizes that this alone is not enough, and therefore also calls for high-income countries to abandon GDP growth as an objective and focus the economy instead on what is required for well-being and social progress. Now remember, GDP is an aggregate metric. It does not distinguish between $1,000 worth of bombs and $1,000 worth of healthcare. Even Simon Kuznets, the man who invented GDP himself, warns that we should never use it as a measure for economic and social well-being. Because when it comes to well-being, as you can imagine, it's not aggregate production that matters, but rather what we are producing and whether people have access to the necessary goods they require to live a decent life. So instead of blindly chasing aggregate growth and hoping this will magically solve our problems, let us be clear about what we actually want to achieve and target those things directly. This focuses the mind. How do we achieve social and ecological goals? The first step is we need to expand and decommodify universal public services. And by this I mean healthcare and education, obviously, yes, but also good, affordable housing, public transit, clean energy, water, internet, nutritious food, recreational facilities, childcare. Let us mobilize our productive forces to ensure that everyone has access to what is necessary for a decent life, regardless of fluctuations in aggregate output. This reduces the cost of living, and this is important for Norway right now, okay? It controls inflation and stabilizes the economy. It's an essential step to delinking well-being from growth. Second, we must invest in ambitious public works programs to build renewable energy, improve public transit, insulate homes, install efficient appliances, restore ecosystems. These are urgent, socially necessary tasks, and we cannot wait around for capital to decide that they are worth doing. We must mobilize to do them directly and fast, harnessing the power of public finance and industrial policy. Such a program can and should also include a public job guarantee, empowering people to train and participate in the most important collective projects of our generation, doing dignified, meaningful work with workplace democracy and living wages. I want you to think about the power of this approach. It allows us to achieve ecological objectives fast, but it also abolishes unemployment. It abolishes economic insecurity. It breaks the political logjam around climate action. And again, important for Norway. Right now, we cannot pursue radical climate action because it might harm employment and livelihoods. By securing employment and livelihoods, we can pursue radical action without anyone worrying about getting hurt, and this is the bread and butter of a just transition. Now, as we improve and secure the socially necessary sectors, we also need to scale down, or degrow, if you like, socially less necessary forms of production. Fossil fuels are obvious here. We need binding targets to wind this industry down. And I urge the Norwegian government to join other governments in signing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. But we also need to reduce production of private jets, SUVs, mansions, industrial beef, fast fashion, the automobile industry, advertising, weapons, right, the military-industrial complex, yachts, cruise ships. There are huge chunks of our economy that are wasteful and destructive and totally unnecessary. We can also end the practice of planned obsolescence and introduce policy to extend product lifespans. This is powerful, by the way. Think about it. If our products last twice as long, we need half as many of them, cutting our energy and material use by 50%. This should be done democratically. And workers in sunset industries should have the guaranteed option of transitioning to socially and ecologically necessary forms of production that they choose, with full support under the job guarantee and no loss of livelihood. That must be an ironclad commitment. Finally, we need to curtail the purchasing power of the very rich, using sensible policy measures like wealth taxes and maximum income ratios. Now, this may sound radical, but think about it. Right now, millionaires alone are on track to burn 72% of the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. This is an egregious assault on humanity and on the rest of the living world, and none of us should accept it. It is irrational and self-defeating for us to continue to devote energy and materials to supporting an over-consuming elite in the middle of an ecological emergency. We know that measures like these, scaling down less necessary forms of production and transforming provisioning systems, can reduce energy use in high-income countries by more than 50%, while at the same time improving social outcomes. And as our society requires less aggregate production to meet our needs, we can shorten the working week, give people more free time, and share necessary labor more evenly, therefore permanently precluding involuntary unemployment. This is extremely powerful in terms of climate mitigation. Less energy demand means we can decarbonize the economy much faster. It also means we require less renewable energy infrastructure to do that. And this is crucial for Norway. It means less appropriation of land and territory and forest for wind turbines and solar panels. right? Another benefit for Norway is that reduced need for imports of cars, for example, a major import here, would mean less need to extract and export oil to finance those imports. This approach also reduces material use, thus stopping and even reversing biodiversity loss and other forms of ecosystem breakdown. This is incredibly hopeful news. It's a powerful antidote to the doomerism and despair that has gripped our culture and our politics. Now, is such a program affordable? Yes, by definition, yes. As Keynes famously pointed out, anything we can actually do in terms of real productive capacity, we can pay for. And when it comes to productive capacity, clearly, as I've just argued, we have far more than enough. Deploying public finance and industrial policy simply shifts the use of this capacity away from wasteful production and elite accumulation to advance social and ecological objectives. Now, some will say this sounds utopian, but these policies happen to be extremely popular. Universal public services, green public works, a public job guarantee, more equality, an economy focused on well-being and ecology rather than growth. Polls and surveys show strong majority support for these ideas, and official citizens' assemblies, democratic processes, in several European countries have called for precisely this kind of transition. A post-growth deal along these lines, a just and ecological post-growth deal, has the potential to become a popular and feasible political agenda. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not just about ecology. It's also crucial to releasing the Global South from the grip of extractivism and impoverishment. Excess energy and material use in the core needs to decline to achieve ecological objectives, while in the periphery, productive capacities need to be reclaimed, reorganized, and increased where necessary in order to meet human needs, with throughput converging globally to levels that are sufficient for universal human welfare and compatible with ecological stability. For the Global South, this requires ending structural adjustment programs, canceling external debts, and enabling governments to use progressive industrial and fiscal policy to improve economic sovereignty, including tariffs and subsidies and capital controls and nationalization and public production. In the absence of effective multilateral action to allow for this, Southern governments can and should take collective steps in this direction, and it is critical that progressive movements everywhere support and defend them toward this end. But none of this is going to happen on its own. It will require a political struggle against those who benefit so prodigiously from the status quo. To get there, it's necessary to build movements that are powerful enough to unseat existing incumbents or otherwise force them to change course. It should be clear to all of us by now that the environmentalist movement cannot do this on its own. It urgently needs to create alliances with unions and working-class political formations to build a broad-based political movement that has real political leverage. And to achieve this, it is critical to foreground the social policy demands that I've highlighted here. But the unions also need to move, and I say this not as a critic from the outside, but as a lifelong union member. How did we ever let the political horizons of the labor movement shrink down to sector-specific battles over wages and conditions without any concern for the well-being of workers in other sectors or non-workers or the unemployed? We must revive our ambitions. Universal public services and a job guarantee are basic demands that any self-respecting labor movement must advance and implement as a top priority, which is also critical to creating the conditions that will make it possible for a just and ecological transition. So let me close by summarizing like this. The vision of a just and ecological future is possible to achieve. We know empirically that it is physically possible to achieve. But it requires a process of substantial transformation if we want to bring this vision into reality. This is not a time for timid responses, tweaking around the edges of a failing, degenerating system. It's time for openness to new ideas. It's time for bold movements. It's time for courage. Thank you.